Discovered my brother inherited the house behind my back. Dad said, he deserves it. You were always the disappointment anyway. So I quietly stopped paying the bills. For weeks later, he texted, why is the power off? Fix it now. No please, no apology. I simply retorted. I, 32 discovered my inheritance was stolen when I found the property deed with my brother's name on it, sitting on Dad's kitchen counter like yesterday's grocery receipt. The worst part wasn't the betrayal. It was how casually Dad delivered the news when I confronted him about it. He looked up from his newspaper, barely acknowledging my presence, and told me my brother deserved the house more than I did. Then came the kicker that still echoes in my head. I was always the disappointment anyway, so what did I expect? 27 years of trying to earn his approval, and that's what I got. A dismissal, a shrug, a confirmation that everything I'd suspected about being the unwanted son was true. But here's what Dad didn't know. I'd been paying every utility bill for that house for the past 3 years. Mom died when I was 15, and Dad never recovered. He became a shell of himself, drinking too much and caring too little. My brother, being the golden child, moved across the country for his tech job and visited maybe twice a year. Meanwhile, I stayed local, checked on Dad weekly, and gradually took over his finances when his drinking got worse. It started small. Dad would forget to pay the electric bill, so I'd cover it. Then the water bill. Then the gas. Eventually, I was handling everything. Mortgage payments, property taxes, maintenance, groceries, his medical bills. I set up automatic payments from my account and never thought twice about it. He was family. This was what you did. My brother knew none of this. In his mind, Dad was still the capable man who'd raised us, just with a few more gray hairs and a tendency to repeat stories. During his rare visits, Dad would pull himself together, hide the empty bottles, and play the part of the functioning widower. My brother bought it completely. I never told Dad I was covering his expenses. His pride was already shattered enough. I figured when the time came, we'd sort out the inheritance fairly. After all, I'd invested years of my life and tens of thousands of dollars keeping him afloat. How naive was I? 3 months ago, I stopped by Dad's place to drop off groceries and found legal documents scattered across his kitchen table. Property transfer papers. All signed, notarized, official. The family house, the one I'd been maintaining and essentially financing, now belonged entirely to my brother. I stared at those papers for a long time, my hands actually shaking. The house was worth around $400,000. More importantly, it represented everything I'd worked for, every sacrifice I'd made to keep our family intact. When I asked Dad about it, he didn't even have the decency to look guilty. He explained that my brother had called a few weeks prior, worried about estate planning and taxes. Dad had decided to transfer the house to him early to avoid complications. It made financial sense, he claimed. My brother had the stable job, the wife, the prospects for kids who might want to visit Grandpa's old house someday. And me? Well, I was 32, single, working a decent but unremarkable job in IT support. In Dad's eyes, I was the son who never quite measured up, the one who stayed too close to home, who never married, who reminded him too much of his own failures. When I pressed him about fairness, about my contributions, about the fact that nobody had consulted me, Dad got irritated. He told me the house was his to give to whoever he wanted. Then he delivered that crushing line about disappointment and desert. I left without saying another word. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and 3 years' worth of bank statements. The numbers were staggering. Between utilities, maintenance, property taxes, and covering Dad's daily expenses, I'd contributed over $60,000 to keeping that house running. $60,000 my brother knew nothing about. I could have confronted my brother directly, could have demanded reimbursement or insisted Dad reverse the transfer, could have made a legal case about my financial contributions. Instead, I decided to let reality teach the lesson. The next morning, I called every utility company and removed my payment authorization. Electric, gas, water, trash, internet. Everything reverted to the original account holder. Dad's name was still on all the services, but the payments would now be drawn from his nearly empty checking account instead of mine. I also stopped the automatic grocery deliveries, canceled his prescription pickup service that I'd been paying for, and discontinued the lawn care service. Every single expense I'd quietly absorbed over the years was now back where it legally belonged. The beautiful part was the timing. My brother had just taken ownership of a house that was about to become a very expensive problem. Dad called me after the first overdue notice arrived, confused about why the electric company was demanding payment. He'd genuinely forgotten that someone else had been handling his bills. 3 years of automatic payments had erased any memory of financial responsibility. I told him he should probably contact my brother about it, since the house was his now. Dad seemed puzzled by the suggestion, but didn't argue. I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the first crack in his confidence about the decision he'd made. The phone calls intensified. Dad was getting shut-off notices for multiple utilities, and his checking account couldn't cover the accumulated bills. He asked if I could help him figure out what was happening with his payments. I explained very calmly that I'd been covering his expenses for years, but since the house no longer had anything to do with me, I'd transferred that responsibility back to the legal owner. Wasn't that what made sense? After all, Dad had said my brother deserved the house more than I did. For the first time in years, I heard my father speechless. My brother finally called. Not me, Dad. According to what Dad told me later, my brother was frustrated about having to deal with utility companies and wondered why Dad hadn't been keeping up with his bills. Dad, to his credit, finally explained that I'd been paying for everything. My brother's response was predictable. He was grateful, of course, but also annoyed that no one had told him about this arrangement. He'd assumed Dad was managing fine on his own. Now he was facing thousands of dollars in catch-up payments and wondering how long this had been going on. Dad suggested my brother should call me to work something out. My brother never called. The power went off on a Tuesday morning. Dad called me in a panic, explaining that the electric company had finally followed through on their shut-off notice. The house was dark, the refrigerator was warming up, and he didn't know what to do. 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a text from my brother. His message was exactly what I'd expected. Demanding, entitled, presumptuous. He wanted to know why the power was off and told me to fix it immediately. Not asked, told. No acknowledgement of the years I'd been covering expenses. No recognition of the financial burden I'd been carrying. No apology for being cut out of the inheritance conversation. Just a command to solve his problem. I screenshot the message and stared at it for a while. 3 years of sacrifices, $60,000 of my own money, and countless hours of worry about Dad's well-being. This was how my contributions were acknowledged, as an obligation to continue paying for a house I'd been deemed unworthy to inherit. I typed my reply carefully, making sure every word was measured and clear. I told him the house was his responsibility now, not mine. I'd been covering Dad's expenses for years without recognition or consultation, but since I was apparently the family disappointment who didn't deserve inheritance rights, I concluded I also didn't deserve the financial obligations that came with them. If he wanted the house to have electricity, he should pay the electric bill. If he wanted Dad to be comfortable, he should take care of Dad's expenses. After all, he was the son who deserved it more. I sent the message and turned off my phone. What followed was 2 days of escalating panic. Dad called my work phone. My brother apparently spent hours on the phone with utility companies trying to get service restored, and by Thursday morning, I had 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. The messages ranged from angry to desperate to guilt-inducing. My brother accused me of being petty and vindictive. He pointed out that Dad was suffering because of my actions. He reminded me that family should come before pride. Dad's messages were more heartbreaking. He finally seemed to understand the scope of what I'd been doing and how his decision had affected me. He asked me to call him back, said we needed to talk, admitted he might have made a mistake. But the most telling message came Friday evening. My brother, finally grasping the financial reality of his inheritance, asked if we could work out some kind of arrangement. Maybe I could continue helping with Dad's expenses, and he'd pay me back when he could afford it. Or perhaps we could split the utility costs going forward. The entitlement was breathtaking. Even faced with the consequences of his actions, he still expected me to solve his problems. Update 1. On Saturday, Dad asked me to come over to discuss the situation. When I arrived, I found my brother there too. Apparently, he'd driven in Friday night to deal with the crisis in person. The house felt different without power. Colder, darker, smaller somehow. Dad looked older than I'd ever seen him, sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread everywhere. Utility bills, bank statements, legal documents. The full scope of the financial mess was finally visible. My brother looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his phone and avoiding eye contact. This was probably the first time he'd seen Dad's actual living situation. The cluttered house, the empty cupboards, the general air of neglect that 3 years of my maintenance had been hiding. Dad started by apologizing. He admitted he'd had no idea how much I'd been contributing and acknowledged that cutting me out of the inheritance conversation had been unfair. He seemed genuinely remorseful, but also confused about how to fix the situation now that legal documents had been signed. My brother's approach was different. He thanked me for everything I'd done, but then immediately started talking about solutions going forward. Could I help get the utilities restored while he figured out long-term arrangements? Could we set up some kind of payment plan for the accumulated bills? I listened to both of them for about 20 minutes before responding. I told them I'd consider resuming payments under specific conditions. First, the house transfer had to be reversed. Not modified, not shared, completely reversed. If my brother wanted to inherit the house eventually, he could discuss that with Dad after demonstrating he could actually take care of it and Dad's needs. Second, I wanted reimbursement for every dollar I'd spent over the past 3 years. Not a payment plan, not a promise to pay back when convenient, immediate reimbursement. I'd kept meticulous records. Third, any future arrangements regarding Dad's care or the house required my input and consent. No more decisions made behind my back. And finally, I wanted a written acknowledgement from both of them detailing my contributions over the past 3 years. Not for legal purposes, but for the record. So there would never again be any question about who had been supporting whom. My brother's reaction was immediate and negative. The reimbursement amount was unreasonable. He couldn't afford $60,000 up front, and reversing the house transfer would create tax complications. He suggested we find a compromise that worked for everyone. I told him the terms weren't negotiable. He could accept them, or he could figure out how to maintain the house and care for Dad on his own. Those were his choices. Update 2. That's when my brother finally lost his composure. He accused me of holding Dad hostage over money. He called my demands extortion and said I was punishing an old man for decisions that weren't entirely his fault. He pointed out that Dad had been drinking heavily when he made the house transfer decision and suggested I was taking advantage of the situation. But then he said something that revealed the truth behind his anger. He'd been planning to sell the house. Not keep it for sentimental reasons, not preserve it for future grandchildren, not maintain it as a family asset. He'd inherited a $400,000 property he intended to liquidate for cash, and my demands were threatening that plan. Dad's face went white when he heard this. The illusion that his golden son cared about preserving the family home crumbled in real time. Everything my brother had said about deserving the house more, about having better prospects for the future, about being the responsible choice, it was all justification for a quick cash grab. The room went silent for a long moment. Then Dad asked my brother directly if he'd been planning to sell. My brother's response was defensive and telling. He said he hadn't made any definite decisions, but the house was worth a lot of money, and he had his own financial obligations to consider. Student loans, mortgage payments, his wife's medical bills from a surgery last year. The house could solve a lot of problems for his family. Dad asked what would happen to him if the house was sold. My brother suggested Dad could move to a smaller place, maybe a nice apartment or assisted living facility. Somewhere easier to maintain, with fewer stairs, closer to medical facilities. Wouldn't that be better for everyone? I watched my father's face during this exchange and saw the exact moment he realized he'd been manipulated. His golden son, the successful one who deserved the inheritance, had been planning to cash out and warehouse Dad somewhere convenient. Dad stood up slowly, his hands shaking with either age or anger. He told my brother the conversation was over and asked him to leave. When my brother started to argue, Dad's voice got harder than I'd heard it in years. He told my brother he'd made a terrible mistake, but it was his mistake to fix. The house transfer would be reversed immediately, and if my brother had a problem with that decision, he could discuss it with a lawyer. Then Dad turned to me and asked what I needed him to do to make this right. I told him we'd start with getting the power turned back on. Update 3. 6 months later. The legal paperwork to reverse the house transfer took 3 months and cost Dad $1,500 in attorney fees. My brother contested it briefly, but his lawyer apparently explained that he had no legal standing to keep property that had been transferred through questionable circumstances. I was reimbursed in full from the proceeds of Dad's retirement account. It hurt his savings, but he insisted it was the right thing to do. He also established a joint checking account with me for household expenses, ensuring I'd never again be carrying costs invisibly. My brother and I haven't spoken since that day in the kitchen. He sent a few text messages over the months, mostly trying to justify his actions or blame me for destroying family relationships. I never responded. Some bridges aren't worth rebuilding. Dad's health has improved significantly. Funny how much better someone can function when they're not drinking themselves to sleep every night out of guilt and self-loathing. He started attending AA meetings and joined a senior center that provides social activities and meal programs. For the first time in years, he seems to have reasons to get up in the morning. The house is mine now, legally and officially. Dad updated his will with proper legal counsel, and there's no ambiguity about inheritance anymore. When the time comes, I'll be prepared to handle his care and his affairs without surprise interventions from family members who suddenly discover their concern. People keep asking if I feel bad about how everything played out. They suggest I was too harsh, too unforgiving, too willing to sacrifice family relationships over money and pride. But this was never about money or pride. This was about recognition, about fairness, about not being taken for granted by people who only valued my contributions when they stopped receiving them. For 3 years, I'd been the invisible son holding our family together. I'd sacrificed my own financial security and personal time to ensure Dad was safe and comfortable. I'd done it without recognition, without gratitude, without even acknowledgement. When Dad decided to reward my brother for his absence, while dismissing my presence as disappointment, he revealed how little my efforts had meant to him. When my brother demanded I continue paying for his inheritance without even saying please, he showed how little he valued my sacrifice. The power going off wasn't the punishment, it was the wake-up call. Sometimes the only way to make people understand your value is to stop providing it. Sometimes the only way to earn respect is to demand it. And sometimes the only way to save a family is to be willing to walk away from it. Dad and I talk every day now. Real conversations about his health, his concerns, his plans for the future. He asks my opinion about decisions and includes me in discussions about his care. He treats me like a son whose thoughts and feelings matter. That's worth more than any inheritance ever could be. My brother learned that golden children who disappear when things get difficult don't deserve to benefit from the hard work of the children who stay. Actions have consequences, even when those actions involve family. And I learned that sometimes the people who call you disappointing are really just disappointed in themselves. The house still needs work, Dad still needs care, and there are probably more difficult conversations ahead. But now we're facing those challenges as a team instead of me carrying everything alone while others make decisions about my life without consulting me. That's not revenge, that's justice. And justice, it turns out, feels a lot like coming home.